So, it has now been about a month since the end of House of the Dragon Season 2, and of course, out there in the world, there are a lot of opinions, a lot of mixed opinions based on how the season actually went. With a lot of people out there believing that the season was an absolute disappointment, many of the episodes being extremely slow, the season not actually progressing the story very far, and there being way too many changes from the book to actually qualify it as a good adaptation. There's been a lot of criticisms about how it actually adapted some of the biggest moments from the books. And then some other people really enjoyed the season. They thought the season, although not as good as Season 1, was still a fun ride that did push the story forward enough, gave some really good action beats, had some great character moments, and opened up the door for a pretty fun Season 3 that I think we will be getting in a couple years. That is kind of where I sit. I was not the biggest hater on this season. I enjoyed it. But the question at the end of the day about House of the Dragon Season 2 has been, what does George R.R. Martin think about it? Because we know George R.R. Martin, of course, the creator of A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones, aka the series that spun off into the House of the Dragon. We know he has his opinions on these things. He's been very vocal about his opinions on the end of Game of Thrones, and he will not keep his mouth shut if he believes in something. And a couple weeks ago, George R.R. Martin made his opinion on House of the Dragon Season 2 very, very clear, writing a blog post that has now been deleted. But guess what? I have it right here, so we're going to go through it, and we're going to talk about what the hell is going on here? So he starts off the thing by saying, back in July, I promised you some further thoughts about Blood and Cheese, and Maelor the Missing after my commentary on the first two House of the Dragon episodes. Because, of course, earlier in the year, he was complaining about the Blood and Cheese moment from House of the Dragon Season 2. If you don't know what Blood and Cheese is, it's the moment from the book and, of course, the show where these two dudes are sent in to King's Landing by Daemon to go and kill Aemon Targaryen, but instead of finding Aemon, they find Helaena and her two kids. In the book, it was 3 kids. There was another son named Maelor, who George is hilariously calling Maelor the Missing, because he's not in the show. He is missing. So George goes on to talk more about that. He talks about the episodes, and he goes on to talk about how Blood kills, he kills Jaehaerys instead of Maelor in the book, and it plays out a little bit different. In the show, they don't really give Helaena a choice. They say, Helaena, which one is the boy? We want to kill the boy. In the book, it's a little darker. They tell Helaena, hey, you have 3 kids, 2 boys. Pick a son. Which son is going to die? They leave it up to her. And she, of course, picks Maelor, aka Maelor the Missing, who is the younger son, believing Jaehaerys, since he is the eldest and the heir, he should survive. And what happens? In a twist of fate, they end up killing Jaehaerys instead, just to kind of say, fuck you, Helaena. And this is a big moment, because now Helaena, in the books, still has to be there with Maelor, her son that she had condemned to death. That is some dark shit that we're missing in the show. George goes on to say, I still believe the scene in the book is stronger. The readers have the right of that. The 2 killers are crueler in the book. I thought the actors who played the killers on the show were excellent, but the characters are crueler, harder, and more frightening in Fire and Blood. In the show, Blood is a gold cloak. In the book, he is a former gold cloak, stripped of his office for beating a woman to death. Book Blood is the sort of man who might think making a woman choose which of her sons should die is amusing, especially when they double down on the wanton cruelty by murdering the boy she tries to save. Book Cheese is worse too. He does not kick a dog, true, but he does not have a dog, and he's the one who tells Maelor that his mom wants his head. I would also suggest that Helaena shows more courage, more strength in the book by offering her own life to save her son. He goes on to talk about how we saw this moment as a Sophie's Choice sort of moment. He wanted to replicate that, and that taking that away from the show kind of hurt the show. And this is just one major moment in Season 2 that I see most people complaining about, the Blood and Cheese moment. And George R.R. Martin has made it very clear that he feels like the show missed the mark. And to be honest, I do too. Watching the show when it first came out, I thought the Blood and Cheese moment was handled well enough, because it is extremely brutal. And you don't want to go so brutal that it kind of turns away your audience, but you also have to remember most of the people watching this show are the same people that kept on watching Game of Thrones after the Red Wedding. And this isn't as bad as that, I don't think. So I think George is just questioning, along with most of the audience, why they made most of these changes in Season 2. Very interesting. He goes on to talk about how he argued with the showrunner Ryan Condal about the decision, and how there were practical reasons for not having Maelor in the show, because they then would have to cast a younger child baby actor, and there's a lot of logistical stuff with that makes it kind of difficult to do. George goes on to talk about how Maelor not being in the show and the Blood and Cheese thing will create a butterfly effect. A lot of things from the books that I don't really want to talk too deeply about here, a lot of different things that he goes through, but one of the main things he says is it will affect the ultimate kind of payoff to Helena's story. And yet again, I don't want to spoil too much from the book here, but what eventually happens with her character in the conclusion there will be kind of trifled on due to the fact that Maelor's not there. And you know what? Her character has been extremely different in the show, so it was always going to be hard to try to replicate what it was in the books, because in the show they decided to go down this route of her being a dreamer, of her being this weird kind of a fortune teller, versus in the book where she's clearly not that. So I am interested to see that different take in the show, but I can understand George's kind of discontent for that. But it goes on and on and on, and the most important thing that I got from this blog post here is the last sentence that he writes, where he says, "And there are larger and more toxic butterflies to come if House of the Dragon goes ahead with some of the changes being contemplated for Season 3 and Season 4. Now that is what scares me and a lot of other House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones fans, because the Mail or the Missing thing and some of the changes that have happened, most of the stuff are not major. They're little character beats that still, I think, fit within the history of A Song of House of Fire, The Dance of the Dragon. Like Alicent Hightower and Rhaenyra's characters being very, very different, whereas in the books they're just kind of angry, vengeful, ambitious people. In the show they seem a little bit more understanding. They're kind of these strong women that are just mad about all the men fighting a war, which if you want to argue about how stupid that is, and that's a kind of over-trifled point in Hollywood right now in every movie, go ahead. But either way, that's a change that doesn't affect too much. In the first season there were changes that didn't affect too much. Mail or the Missing, they can write around it if they're smart enough, but apparently there are much bigger changes to come. And of course, the House of the Dragons storyline here, the Dance of the Dragons, if you know what's coming, there are very, very big moments, very, very big story beats that I feel like need to be hit. And we've covered a lot of the setup for this war already, so the story beats that we're going to get are these major, major things that I don't know if you could change them. So when he says something like this, it makes me think, what is going to be changed? The order of how characters are going to potentially die? Who ends up on the Iron Throne at the end of the entire Dance of the Dragons? How the Starks play into it? What are the major, major changes that we're going to be foreseeing, and what are the reasons for changing these things? And this really makes me think about what it means to be a showrunner adapting another writer's work. If you're somebody adapting a fantasy book, a very large story, a historical, fictional story, how do you adapt it while being faithful, appeasing the fans, but also making it good for TV and something that works on TV? Because so far, I think Ryan Condal's done a decent job, but there are clearly changes here that have upset the fans and upset TV audiences. And obviously, we've seen in the past through two different mediums most recently, Game of Thrones Season 8, and of course, you have the Rings of Power show, the Lord of the Rings show, is that sometimes people just don't know what they're doing when they're adapting material that they don't particularly understand. And who is to blame for this? Are we supposed to say that Ryan Condal needs to adapt this show beat for beat, word for word in the Fire and Blood book? I don't think anybody's saying that, but at the same time, there are major, major story things and world aspects that should be kept the same. And I think when the creator of the world, George R.R. Martin, is emotionally and loudly getting upset about this, I think people should listen. He's alive to complain about this. Tolkien is not alive to complain about the Rings of Power, although I think he probably would. You can make faithful adaptations to incredible novel work, to incredible writing. You look at the Denis Villeneuve Dune films. Those books do change some minor things with some of the characters. I mean, Chani in Dune is almost a completely different character than she is in the books, but that's okay because he is faithful enough to the core aspects and themes of what Dune actually is that it makes it work. So House of the Dragon, I think the main thing that people are upset about, and maybe George is upset about not completely vocalizing, is that it doesn't just feel like they're changing some story aspects. It seems like they may be changing some of the original themes and plot points and main emotional points that he had kind of presented with a lot of these stories. But George is not innocent in all of this. He's not. You know why he's not? Because he didn't finish writing The Winds of Winter. And I know what you're saying. Why does The Winds of Winter have anything to do with any of this? It doesn't, but it did have something to do with Season 8 of Game of Thrones. So, joke's on you, George. But that's the video. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like this video, subscribe for more. Tell me what you guys think of this whole thing down below. I'll see you in the next one.